Welcome to the second season of SciAc Actually, a podcast by Imperial College London students and staff. We're delighted to have you back for a new exciting topic, the science of the future. Tag along as we ask Imperial's experts to give us a glimpse of what's ahead of us.
Hi, and welcome to this episode of SciAc Actually podcast. My name is Eva, a second-year biological sciences student from the SciAc Actually team. In this episode, I am excited to have with me one of the co-founders of FlexSea, a startup with its origins here at Imperial. FlexSea was a finalist of the 2022 Venture Catalyst Challenge, which is Imperial's flagship entrepreneurial competition for students and alumni to develop an innovative idea for commercialization. Our guest, Carlo Fedeli, co-founded FlexSea with the aim to change our relationship with plastic. The aim was to develop a biodegradable, compostable packaging made from seaweed. Carlo obtained a master's degree in innovation, entrepreneurship, and management from Imperial Business School. The second co-founder of FlexSea, Thibaut Monfort, holds a master's degree in materials engineering from Imperial College. Carlo, thank you so much for joining us on this podcast. I wanted to start off by asking you about the history of your startup. When and how was FlexSea founded?
Hi, and thank you for having us. So, in brief, FlexSea started with COVID, in a sense, which is kind of funny to say it this way, but I was finishing my master's at the business school at Imperial when COVID hit. I noticed, being stuck in lockdown, all the plastic that was coming home, both through online groceries, Amazon deliveries, and whatnot. When you say delivery, you say plastic packaging. And I thought, well, that's way too much. We need to do something about it. I looked at existing solutions that were out there. So we have recycling, which might seem like a good thing, but really doesn't deliver on its promises. On a global scale, roughly only 9% of plastic is actually recycled. When it comes to plastic films especially, almost nothing is recycled because it's often either too thin or not clean enough to recycle. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have existing bioplastics, which are all derived today from land crops. All these vegetables need arable land, which is an increasingly scarce resource, as well as fresh water, and then also pesticides and fertilizers. And all of this to produce bioplastics, which in most cases, it is only industrially compostable. It's not home compostable. It will not biodegrade in nature. So I thought, well, we need to do better. Let's see. Let's look at, for example, seaweed, which I already knew was a very renewable resource, a resource which was growing a lot in its production. And I knew there were other startups trying to develop bioplastic from seaweed, but they were doing it for brown seaweed. And I knew already that red seaweed was more abundant, so I thought, well, maybe we should do something with red seaweed, because if you want to work with plastic, you want to work with large volumes, and when you work about large volumes, you want to tap into the biggest resource as possible. So let's do red seaweed. And that's how it started. And I transformed my house into a lab for about 3 months and a half during lockdown, and did different iterations, different formulations. And by the end of lockdown, I had a material, a very early prototype, which I could hold in my hands and create in my kitchen lab in relatively little amount of time and fairly easily. Then, of course, I worked on it for another few months until I realized again that I'm not a chemist and I probably need someone with a bit more of a scientific background. And that's when I called Thibaut, who is a scientific man compared to me. And so that was around January or February last year. And I told them, listen, let's embark on this adventure together. You take care of the science side, I take care mostly of the business side. And that's been what we've done ever since. So now about a year and a half into the project working together. We are a VC funded startup. We are moving into better labs. We're starting initial pilots, and our material has improved dramatically. Yeah, so this is where we are and where it all started, really. It all started in a kitchen. A lot of startups, you hear, for example, I don't know, Apple or whatever, they start in a garage. We started in a kitchen. I guess the kitchen is nicer, at least you have food. In a garage, you don't.
That works. Yeah, so as you said, you both have different backgrounds. So Thibaut is more of like the scientist, you're more of like the businessman. Was that an advantage when you founded FlexSea compared to other startups where it's just researchers that are planning a project?
There's a clear difference between researchers and people who have more of a business mindset, in the sense that a businessman or an entrepreneur is motivated by the objective, the target. They work towards a well-defined thing that they want to achieve, whereas a researcher, they work towards a direction as well, but they're much more interested in the process itself. Compared to many other startups which are led by researchers, there definitely is a bit more of a market-oriented approach, which allows us to be a bit more maybe pragmatical on certain aspects. And it's good that we both share this.
Yeah, so following up from that, I wanted to ask you about the product itself. So when I think about seaweed, I think about, this strong smelling, kind of unpleasant thing that sticks to my legs when I'm trying to enjoy a nice beach. And so our podcast polling team actually seemed to think the same, and they've asked if you could briefly describe the product itself and how you're making it from seaweed.
Yes. No, it is true that seaweed really is the memory of being a kid on a beach and having a piece of brown, semi-decomposed things stuck to your leg, and it just grows and then it dries and you can't take it off your skin. It's horrible. So the seaweed that we use is, as I mentioned, it's red seaweed. So quickly give you an overview of the seaweed market and how it works. You have roughly 50% of the seaweed in the world being red seaweed, 35% brown and 15% green. Those are more or less roughly the splits. And however, when it comes to red seaweed, about 97 to 99% of the red seaweed is cultivated, whereas brown seaweed mostly is harvested from the wild. And of course, there is cultivation starting now, especially in the kelp. The production at scale from a commercially domesticated variety of seaweed has only just begun in the brown, whereas with red, it's been going on for 50 years. And also when you look at what we use in the seaweed, we use polysaccharides within the seaweed. So our polysaccharides are roughly 20 to 30% of the seaweed's dry weight. Whereas in brown seaweed, you have about 15 to 25. So there is more in red as well. So that all goes back to my idea of being able to scale up. We not only tap into a raw material which is more abundant, we also tap into a raw material which has more abundancy of what we need within it. And you can cut it and harvest it in just 45 days. So that's an incredibly rapid life cycle. And as long as you leave a tiny bit on the rope through vegetative propagation, that will grow again and you can carry on to another harvest. The species that we use are semi-tropical and tropical seaweeds, so they have very much predictable peaks and troughs of their productivity. So once you harvest seaweed, you want to dry it. And when you dry it, you lose about 90 to 95% of its weight. Seaweed is mostly water. And then you have the dry seaweed. The dry seaweed is then milled, and there's an extraction process involving an alkali bath where you extract the polysaccharides that we use. We use those polysaccharides, which today are already pre-extracted by certain companies. So we work with those. We don't work with the raw material itself. And we use those powders. That's what they come from. And it's a form of powder. We combine it with other additives to give the characteristics that we wanted, both from a barrier property and also simply material physical properties. And that's sort of like our secret sauce or black magic, if you like. And we come out with this bioplastic, which is transparent, heat sealable, and hopefully we can use it to replace single-use flexible plastic. But this is just a start. In the future, we definitely want to look also at the seaweed extraction and look at all the sort of waste that is used now in the seaweed. Because obviously, I said there's roughly 20 to 30% of that polysaccharide that we use. The 70% for now, it's given as cattle feed or thrown away. But really, there's still a lot of pigments, cellulose, vitamins, lipids, proteins that we can still extract value from. And that's what we want to do. We want to use the whole crop because seaweed is such a natural but yet rich resource that it would be a shame not to give it this aspect of circularity where you can use the whole crop.
So following up from that, FlexSea's philosophy incorporates 11 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, including climate action and responsible production and consumption. So when you talk about this circularity, is that what makes your product better in terms of carbon footprint? Is that why it's advantageous over the current plastic that we have?
So the seaweed has a huge carbon capture aspect to it as it grows. Roughly, you sequestrate 2 kilotons of CO2 per square hectare cultivated per year. If then you also take into account the life cycle CO2 emissions of polyethylene, which is roughly 6 kilograms. You have to subtract not only the amount of carbon that the seaweed has taken in producing it, but also the 6 kilograms of CO2 that have been avoided by basically replacing plastic with FlexSea. So that's definitely a big advantage into it. The other side, if we can talk of circularity, is that we come from nature and we go back to nature, because as our material is used and then it is disposed of and it will be eventually degraded in nature and composted, the nutrients in the seaweed will go back either to the water, if it decomposes in water, or in the soil, that we're not taking away anything because everything goes back to it. And in fact, there's also a big potential for seaweed cultivation and multi-trophic aquaculture, where you can even use fish or prawns that are grown with the seaweed, in which case the fish and the prawns are fed, they produce waste, the waste feeds, if you want, or fertilizes the seaweed in the water, which grows, then you use the plastic, and then it all goes back in this sort of continuous cycle. So there is this aspect that that must not be undervalued, because it's a really big pro for us.
Right, so when you talk about compostable, biodegradable, what does it actually mean, one, from a customer point of view, and two, from like a business point of view? Is it something that we can do as customers, or do we have to do something in particular to recycle this product?
So the good thing is that recycling doesn't work. And I say this is a bit of a weird sentence, but it's a good thing, because it means that although our material is not recyclable, should it end up in a recycling stream because people think it's plastic and it goes there, it will be washed off with the recycling washing process at the facilities. So it will not harm recycling streams. However, around only 9% of plastic actually makes it through that cycle, which means that if a consumer thinks it's plastic and it puts it in that batch, there actually is a 91% chance it will end up in a landfill or leak to nature or incinerated. Of course, the ideal solution is you have a garden or a home compost at home, or you have some sort of a food waste management scheme where you live, and that is the ideal place for Flex to go. But should it end up in other places, it will still do no harm, and in fact be a much better alternative than petroleum-based plastic.
Cool. And does that impact its shelf life in any way?
No, because when you want to look at degradation, you have to take into account the three main factors that affect the degradation of our material and of pretty much anything, in fact. So you have moisture, oxygen availability, and microbial activity. And of course, temperature, in the sense that the warmer it is, the faster the process will be, in our case. So with FlexSea, it's a pretty relatively inert material that will stay on the shelf for a relatively long amount of time. However, it will start the degradation process that takes roughly 8 to 12 weeks. Once those factors that I just mentioned are enhanced. But before that, it will behave just like plastic. And that is sort of the benefit of what we're doing, because that's a great sentence that actually Thibaut came with, is that people love innovation but hate change. And that is completely true. We're not here to revolutionize how people behave with plastic. We're here to revolutionize how plastic behaves with the world. Because plastic is a great material that we've been using wrong, because it has exceptionally high characteristics and qualities, and extremely long-lasting qualities especially, which are its biggest strength, but also its biggest problem for us today. We cannot replace a material that is that good. We can find a better material for the application that we're using it for today. And that is where we come in.
Lovely. So using macroalgae, which is another name for seaweed, as a source to make new and more sustainable products, has gained a huge spotlight over the last few years. And because of this recent hype, some investors actually tend to be more reluctant to invest in this technology, as many companies overpromise and underdeliver. And investors, they want to hear what's hot, but they also want to hear what's real and concrete. So how are you, as FlexSea, approaching these investors and standing out amongst similar companies?
Speaking with investors, it's never easy. It always is a hit or miss. And you can tell within the first, let's say, 20 minutes of a call whether it's going to be a good call or not. Having said this, it is true that there is the risk for like a seaweed bubble to be created. As I said, seaweed is a really big growing industry, and not only for bioplastics. There's so many different applications. I'm sure we've all used seaweed today and we don't even know it. It's in toothpaste, it's in shampoo, it's in cosmetics. And we don't even know it. So when talking to investors, you have to let them understand what makes you different. And in our case, firstly is using the red seaweed, which sets us apart in the bioplastic industry, which means we can have completely different material characteristics than competitors trying to use brown seaweed, such as transparency. You cannot achieve that level of transparency that we have with brown seaweed and alginate derivatives. It simply doesn't work that way. And transparency is something very important, so you want to leverage this aspect when you talk, for example, about a commercial application. People want to buy with their eyes, so you obviously want to see what's inside. And at the same time, using red seaweed allows us to have a heat sealable material, whereas with alginate, you cannot achieve heat sealability. So really, you want to point out why using our specific kind of seaweed makes us better. And at the same time, you also want to give credibility to the project. You really want to show that you're doing what needs to be done and that you have a clear set and focused timeline of what you want to do, both on the commercial side and on the research side. Seaweed will be the future, probably for bioplastics, at least that's what we cross our fingers for, but definitely for many other things as well. So you have to find the investor that recognizes that, and that means find an investor that didn't just get into it now because they've heard of it, but investors that actually are interested in it from probably before that, because it will be them that actually know what's going on, and they're not just attracted to seaweed by the sparkly aspect that it might have in the past month.
Right, so in terms of the product itself that you have now, where are you at with it? Do you have a prototype? Do you have something physical that we can touch? What does it look like?
Yes, absolutely. We have a fairly advanced prototype that we can produce in our labs. So we're still in a lab stage. We're pre-commercial, if not for small pilots. And we can produce the material in our laboratories within a few hours, with the only byproduct literally being just water vapor. It exists. Yes, our product is a reality.
Amazing. And so, as you said, you're doing a lot of things right now. It's a very busy time. And in relation to that, where do you see FlexSea in 5 or 10 years? What's the future of your company?
So hopefully, but then our material which we're working on right now, the film, will be produced by several plastic producers today, which we will have helped transition to a more efficient and sustainable alternative to what they're doing now. And we will be working on extracting the true value of the seaweed rather than just the 30% polysaccharides. And we will also have been working and hopefully have in production other verticals that we want to explore. For example, we want to create rigid and semi-rigids and also foams.
I believe that's a great way to conclude this episode. Thank you, Carlo, for taking us through your product and for telling us more about the business aspect of a startup. Thank you for joining us and for telling us more about your product and company, FlexSea.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and please look us up where we just launched a new website, and we also have very, very active on the LinkedIn page. So if you want to learn more, go there and don't be afraid to contact us.
You can find all relevant information for this episode, such as the website and social media, in the description of this episode and on our website. Thank you for listening to this episode of SciAc S2E5 podcast.